My name is Chris Murphy, and I have the honor of being the junior senator from the great state of Connecticut, and I am thrilled to have you all here today, as much as it is somewhat uncomfortable to have an overflow room. We're excited that there is so much interest in this briefing and in this topic in general, and in particular, I'm so happy to have this panel. I'm just here to kick it off. I'll be around for most of it to listen, but to have Mike Thompson, to have Mike Lawler, to have Senator Whitmire, to have Linda and Bob here as well. You're going to hear over the course of the next hour, hour and a half, really an amazing story about what's happened across this country with respect to reform in our juvenile justice system. Let me also thank some of the people that were really instrumental in getting this briefing together. I want to thank Mike Thompson and his team at the Council of State Governments from Connecticut, my great friends Abby Anderson and Diane Serpina, Liz Ryan from the Campaign for Youth Justice, and the entire staff at the Juvenile Policy Institute. Here's the statistic that I just keep on coming back to over and over and over again. I've worked on this issue for most of my time in public service. When Mike Lawler and I served together in the state legislature, I was the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on the Judicial and Corrections System. Today, in my work in the House and the Senate, I've led an effort to try to reform the federal juvenile justice policy, particularly through the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. But here's the number that guides me. In Connecticut, it costs about $14,000 a year to educate a student. In Connecticut, it costs $270,000 a year to house a child in custody. I can make all the moral arguments in the world why we should find more appropriate settings for kids who have done something wrong, often through their upbringing, than prisons. But I can just make a plain and simple fiscal argument in a time of tight budgets that it makes absolutely no sense to continue to house as many kids as we do in prisons when it costs about 10% of that amount to keep the kids in school, to keep the kids in those communities. After a pretty significant run-up with respect to the number of kids in prison, such that America became the #1 nation in the world when it comes to children in custody, we have seen over the last 10 years a gentle but substantial downward slope. That's great news. We're still #1 when it comes to the number of kids that we lock up, but we're moving in the right direction. We're moving in the right direction largely because a handful of about a dozen states have led the way. Over the last decade, about 10 to 15 states have figured out that there are 6 or 7 pretty common sense steps that you can take to divert kids out of incarceration in the first place, and to the extent that you need to find a more secure setting, get them the help that they need to move them back into the community as quickly as possible. We've also figured out that there's a pretty predictable pathway to incarceration that very often starts in schools. We've talked over the last decade about the school to prison pipeline, and it's real. Exclusionary discipline policies that push kids out of schools through either suspensions or expulsions lead way too often to then a follow-on interaction with the criminal justice system. And so what we figured out is that it's not just reforming your juvenile justice system, it's also reforming your system of education. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, over the last year, one simple change has cut in half, in 1 year, the number of kids who have been arrested in those school systems. That one change, taking the cops out of the hallways at the high schools and moving them into the streets outside. They're just a few steps away if there's a problem that needs to be taken care of, but they are not the day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute enforcers of school discipline policy any longer. And guess what? The hallways of the schools in Bridgeport aren't any less safe, and less kids are going to jail. It's simple, tried and true policies like that that replicated across the country can make the gains that we've seen in the states represented here today. So I'm going to turn this over to our panel. At first, we're so excited about what we'd done in Connecticut, and I'm going to let Mike Lawler tell you about what we did in Connecticut, that we wanted to tell the Connecticut story. And then, of course, we realized that, Connecticut is just one of a handful of states, and we are going to hear today success stories in Connecticut and Ohio and Texas. And one of, I think, the byproducts of being able to tell the story from a variety of perspectives is to show my colleagues in the Senate and the House that this has nothing to do with whether you are a blue state or you are a red state or whether you are a purple state. In fact, this issue of moving both kids but also adults out of prison and back into more appropriate settings is an issue that is now more than ever before uniting liberals and conservatives. And as we try to find a handful of areas where we can both advance social policy gains and save a whole mess load of money, this is at the top of the list. Getting kids out of prison is just a good thing to do for our conscience as a nation, but it is a real quick way to save money. $14,000 a year, keep a kid in a school, $270,000 a year to lock them up. I'm going to let our moderator introduce the panel to you. Let me just specifically thank Bob Listenby for being here today. We're so excited to have him as our new head of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Brings just an amazing practical background to an office that we hope will lead with new vigor as we now have evidence behind our argument. And then my thanks to my great friend, Mike Lawler. Mike was a lone voice in the national wilderness for a long time, talking about a better way to treat kids when they get in trouble. Connecticut has probably been the most aggressive of all 50 states in changing the way that we deal with children in our juvenile justice system. But a lot of us consider ourselves Johnny-come-latelys to a mission that Mike, first as the chairman of our Judiciary Committee in the state legislature, now as our governor's right-hand man on these issues, has been working for a long time. Mike Thompson also has been a leader. Mike originally transformed CSG's regional criminal justice program into the National Justice Center, which he now directs. Last year, the center released a major study on school discipline disparities in Texas, armed with a lot of data that were able to allow them to make the case. As someone who believes that we should do more to address these disparities, I just am so happy to have Mike as our moderator, as a national leader on these issues. I'm going to turn it over to him to welcome and moderate our panel. Please welcome Mike Thompson.
Senator Murphy, thank you so much. This is just a really extraordinary and unprecedented event, pulling this whole group together, and we are extremely grateful to you. Many people who followed Senator Murphy back to his early days in Connecticut know that whether he was in the Connecticut State House or in the Connecticut State Senate, he was a true advocate for change in the juvenile justice system. You heard him make the economic case for it. He made the public safety case for it, and he also made the case because it's right to do for kids and families. And so we've been incredibly grateful to him for all he's done to champion at the state level, and then when he came to the U.S. House of Representatives and now in the U.S. Senate, really championing this issue of juvenile justice reform. But what's really special about Senator Murphy is that he does a lot of this from the Education Committee, from the Help Committee. And so he really gets how the intersection of these two issues, this intersection, as he mentioned earlier, about what happens early on in elementary and then secondary education, and then the connection into the juvenile justice system. And so that's what, for me, makes this whole event so special, is that he's really bringing those two communities together. There's a lot of advocacy and a lot of work among leaders in the front lines of the education system to try to make sure kids stay in school, and there's a lot of work within the juvenile justice system to try to make sure that fewer kids are involved in the juvenile justice system. And Senator Murphy has brought us all together behind a shared agenda. And so, Senator, thank you very, very much for all you're doing on this. I know that as a fellow staffer to legislators, I always have to single out to the people behind the scenes who make a lot of this happen. And Hayne, we're so grateful that Senator Murphy saw you and brought you over. We were all very sad to see your detail end before, and then thrilled that it got a renewal for a year. And Senator Murphy, we're not at all surprised that you plucked her and asked her to work with you. So Hayne, thank you for all you're doing on these particular issues. Before I introduce our panel, again, I just want to help lay out for folks who may not be familiar just how much has been going on the ground among all of these different groups and how this really is a coming together. And there's a lot of these people in the room who's made this happen. There's been private foundations like the Annie E. Casey Foundation that's been working on the JDAI initiative, really trying to help communities understand how they don't need to be as dependent on detention to respond to kids who are committing particular offenses. MacArthur's Models for Change has looked at what the states can do and bring the research to bear to really change things there. How great is it to see the Pew Charitable Trusts come to the table and announce that juvenile justice, it's going to be one of its priorities, and using its signature strategies of bringing people across the political spectrum and data to try to make changes. The Tao Foundation, working in Connecticut, is obviously responsible in many ways for this panel. The Public Welfare Foundation for all it's doing to connect advocates and policymakers. Just this great momentum and groundswell from the philanthropic community, partnering with so many of the advocates and the people across the juvenile justice system in the room. And then we look at school discipline, right? And we look at Atlantic Philanthropies. We look at a number of other private foundations that are really championing the work in that area, working with a whole number of advocacy groups from the Advancement Project, the Legal Defense Fund, to Appleseed, and again, bringing all those groups together on the school discipline issues. And so here we are today to talk about 3 states that really are getting it from schools to the juvenile justice system, and as Senator Murphy mentioned, it aren't seeing it through a political lens, but really seeing this as a data driven issue that makes sense no matter what end of the political spectrum you're from and no matter what part of the system you work in. And so I'm thrilled to be the moderator for this panel. My name again is Michael Thompson, and I run the Justice Center at the Council of State Governments, and we're thrilled to have our chair of our board here, Tom Stickrath, who used to run the juvenile justice system in Ohio and has been instrumental in so much of our work here. And so Tom, thank you for all you've done on behalf of the Justice Center. So let me introduce our panelists now, and I've warned each of our panelists, and I hope they won't mind when I interrupt them and redirect, that this is going to be a very interactive discussion. I do understand, if I have this right, that because this is being live streamed, the cameras can't necessarily see you, so when you talk, if you can, stand up. So now I'm going to have to also push them back down, I guess, at certain moments when we're going to need to segue to the next question. But let me introduce again the panel. You heard a lot about Mike Lawler, who's been a wonderful mentor for me personally and a real champion of change in Connecticut. You heard he's a former prosecutor who led the Judiciary Committee for many, many years, and many of us were thrilled to see Governor Malloy designate him as the kind of crime policy czar, if you will, for the state of Connecticut, and he oversaw a lot of juvenile justice changes in Connecticut. So Mike Lawler is going to speak first to issues in Connecticut, and then we're going to turn to Senator John Whitmire from Texas. Senator Whitmire is known as the Dean of the Senate, and there's only one person in the Texas legislature who can be called the dean, and that's because you're the longest serving legislator in the entire legislative body. 40 years now, I believe, Senator has been in the legislature. He chairs the Criminal Justice Committee in Texas, and it is very well known from anybody in Texas, if you want to do anything on the issue of justice, whether it's juveniles or adult, it's going to go through this leaders committee, and he's been instrumental in really changing things there in Texas, and we're thrilled to have Senator Whitmire really spearhead our work in school discipline and this juvenile justice be part of this panel as well. To his right is Judge Teodosio from Summit County, Ohio. She is a juvenile court judge in Summit County. She's been a juvenile court judge since 2003. And has a long experience in the court system and as an attorney, as a municipal court judge, as a magistrate. And Ohio, as many of you know, has been such a terrific leader in this. Ohio's a home rule state. It's got to go through the courts. And so you have here not only 3 very different states, red, blue, and purple, as was mentioned earlier, but all 3 branches of government as well, and the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And I think some really interesting perspectives where you're going to hear a lot of common themes. We're also thrilled that this is a federal, state, local partnership. And Administrator Listenby, I think I can speak for everybody in the room. There was a huge cheer of excitement when we heard that you would be appointed, not only because someone was going to be appointed to the position, right? That would have been just a start. We're excited about that. But really, I think everybody knew that when you were appointed to this position, what a signal it was from the Attorney General, from the President, about how important it was to really improve our juvenile justice system and look at this linkage to the school system. You all know his bio, but I just want to say it again. He comes from Philadelphia, having run the juvenile defender unit there for 16 years. He's been in the system throughout his entire life, nearly 30 years, working on behalf of kids who are coming in contact with the juvenile justice system. So please join me in welcoming a fantastic panel here today. Okay, so these are the trends that we're seeing nationally, right? As was mentioned to Senator Murphy, we're seeing a significant decline, and this is extraordinary, right? I mean, 32% in really the rates of the percentage in decline in youth confinement across the country. But as Senator Murphy said, there's a few states that are really driving this trend nationally, and these are the states that we have here, and you can see just how instrumental they've been. I mean, imagine cutting by half the number of kids in confinement, really extraordinary. So we're going to start with a Connecticut story, and I'm just going to have a couple graphs behind them so people can see these trends. But I'm going to ask each panelist, just give us a quick sense of what was the problem that state policymakers sort of came to where they realized they had to change the status quo, and then give us a quick sense of what some of the key policy changes were and some of the results that you've seen. So I'll start with Undersecretary Lawler.
So I'm supposed to stand up, right, Mike?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I think the turnout here today says more about the sort of consensus around the country that there are achievements that can be made. There's experiments that have already taken place in a bunch of states, and there's some successes that we can point to. And it's my honor today, together with these other folks, to describe some of the successes. But I want to begin by saying one thing. We're going to talk about a change process in Connecticut. And you should know that Connecticut is unique in some ways, and those of you from other states can recognize this right off the bat. I mean, we have no county government at all. We have no county sheriffs, no county jails. And so everything happens at the state level. It makes it a little bit easier to do changes. Plus, we have no elected judges, no elected prosecutors, and that takes a dimension out of these discussions. So in Connecticut, it's really all happening at the state legislature, and it does sort of simplify the process. So I wanted to say that up front in case people want to just photocopy the Connecticut process and try and do it in a different state. It doesn't exactly work that way. Another thing that's very unique in Connecticut, and I'm pretty sure that the United States Senate's not going to want to borrow this model, but in Connecticut, our committees are joint committees. So the representatives and the senators serve together on a committee. Each committee has 2 co-chairs, and each senator has the same vote as a member of the House does, and I'm pretty sure you're not going to want to adopt that system. But it does simplify things. We have a relatively good tradition of nonpartisan sort of consensus-building policy making. So I wanted to say that up front. The other thing is, as with every reform process, there comes a critical moment, right, when complicated change really faces the maximum pressure. And in Connecticut, it was the moment where people estimated what the actual cost would be to implement the changes we're talking about. And at that moment, people were saying that in Connecticut it would cost $100 million to do the major juvenile justice reform that we were hoping to do. And at that time, the legislature had to make a decision, are we willing to go forward with a change that could cost that much? And we have a small state, so $100 million is a lot of money in Connecticut to add to an existing budget. And it was Senator Murphy, when he was a state legislator, who was in the critical position of saying, go, no go, because he was the chair of the relevant appropriations subcommittee that did that. So the decision was made to go forward with this. And so what led up to that decision? Well, Connecticut, like a lot of states in the early 1990s, did a major juvenile justice reform, making it, among other things, easier to transfer juveniles to the adult system. Another thing you should know that's very unique about Connecticut is for the entirety of our state's history, the age of adult court jurisdiction began on your 16th birthday. And so what that means in Connecticut, when you were 16 years old, you went to adult court, even if it was a shoplifting or breach of peace case, that's where you went. The vast majority of states, as you know, start at age 18, and then 10 or so start at age 17. Connecticut was one of 3 states, New York, North Carolina, and us, starting at 16. So the decision we had to make was, given the reforms that were made in the 1990s, did we think we could get better outcomes by having all 16 and 17-year-olds go to juvenile court instead? And that was the change that carried the $100 million a year price tag. And cutting to the chase, at the end of the day, it didn't really cost $100 million. It only cost about $34, $35 million to do this change. But the results, some of which you're seeing on this chart behind me, speak for themselves. So just for example, the number of children in juvenile detention facilities has been cut in half. In fact, we only have 3 juvenile detention facilities in Connecticut, and we're able to close 1 of those 3, and the remaining 2 are only half full. Now keep in mind, we added all 16 and 17-year-olds to the mix. That's like a 50% increase in the cohort that could end up in the juvenile justice system. But even with that, our juvenile detention population was cut in half. And the juvenile prison, so to speak, the secure facility where the adjudicated children go, is no bigger today in terms of its population than it was before the change was implemented. And that's why it didn't really cost the $100 million that was originally forecast. Another big stumbling block at the outset was people talking about how it was impossible to do this. Forget about how much money it would cost. They talked about how they would have to restructure police departments and build new juvenile courts, et cetera, and this was unthinkable to them, this influx of children coming into the system. And that's why so much of the reform focused on alternatives to putting kids into the court system at all, or at least the juvenile justice part of the court system. And that was the centerpiece of the Raise the Age effort. And so there's some key ingredients to this, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about the details in a few minutes, but the key ingredients were, first and foremost, the community, the grassroots advocacy that led up to this. And I have to say, I've been involved in a lot of legislative change initiatives, but this one had a more powerful voice in the community than any other I've been involved with. And it was mostly young people themselves. In fact, there are a lot of young people of color coming to the Capitol, speaking eloquently about the need for this reform and saying that these reforms would lead to good results. And some of the leaders of that are here today. You know, Abby and Diane are here. These are the people that helped organize it. And if you get this book, this sort of explanation of what happened in Connecticut, I think they have some copies here today. One of the photos you'll see is the gallery of the Legislative Office Building just filled with young people wearing the Raise the Age t-shirts. That advocacy, together with some very powerful legislative leaders, you know, and it wasn't me, it was 2 African-American women from New Haven, the 2 co-chairs of the legislature's Appropriation Committee, who led this charge through the very painstaking process of meeting with all the stakeholders and calling them on the misinformation they were putting out there. Not intentionally, I think they were really afraid of what this change would mean, but that painstaking process led to the results we have today. And there's many ingredients, but I'll mention just one, and that is that just a couple of years ago, the legislature enacted a legislation that essentially prohibited placing children in detention without a specific order of a judge. Because in the past, the police would send them, and then later on, a judge would take a look at it. But now, that obstacle is right there at the front, which forces people to focus on who really needs to be in detention and who doesn't.
So I'm going to just jump in right there. Excuse me, I'm sorry, Undersecretary Lawler, but you can hear there a powerful story about how Connecticut changed the age, right? And a number of states are still struggling on this particular issue, as many of the advocates in this room know, but a really compelling story of how the minimum age was changed for entry into the juvenile justice system. We'll hear more about the process that Connecticut followed in a minute. I want to turn to Texas and to Chairman Whitmire and a little bit about Senator Whitmire. It was a different kind of crisis, right, that prompted the conversation in Texas. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. First, let me say, after listening to Senator Murphy, I can go back to Texas because this subject's in great hands right here. To hear his passion and his understanding of the issue is very rewarding, and also to be with these other professionals at the front. Texas background. I went to Senate in '83 out of Houston after being in the House 10 years. In '93, Lieutenant Governor asked me to do criminal justice. Our adult system was totally imploding, as other parts of the country were experiencing. revolving door of the adult system. You spent about 1 month for every year that you were sentenced. So we went in a huge expansion in the adult system. Then in the 90s, I started leading reforms to look for diversions, alternatives to the adult system, largely based on drug and alcohol treatment. You say, well, why do you bring that up? This is not the adult discussion. It's because I'm the first to have apologized publicly in Texas for not spending more time on the juvenile system. And you say, why didn't you? Out of sight, out of mind. First of all, the adult system had us overwhelmed. That's the public outcry for public safety. 150,000 inmates. That's 1.5 Waco, Texas, that we incarcerated at 111 locations. The bottom line is we were overwhelmed with an adult problem and did not realize in our communities we were also realizing an implosion, a breakdown. Governor Bush was the governor, President Bush was governor in the mid-90s. Part of his campaign, hold them accountable. That's where we went zero tolerance with the juveniles. What was happening without our knowledge is rural settings, our population of the juvenile confinees were growing. 6 years ago, it was at 5,000 people. 5,000 young people were in rural settings. Where do they come from? They come from the urban communities. Very diverse, language issues, African-American overrepresentation out of Houston. They're sent them to the remote areas of West and East Texas. And this is what we ought to all search our conscience in our operations in all 50 states. Where are your juvenile facilities? Out of sight, out of mind. I'm the first, worked my tail off in the criminal justice system, but I didn't realize the problem until we had a scandal 6 years ago. In the middle of the night, in a remote town of about 200 people, way far west Texas, mostly urban, minority kids, administrators, staff were taking them out of their dorms into the offices at night and sexually abusing them. Young man kept having outcries. Finally, a Texas Ranger, law enforcement heard about it, and they're not out of sight, out of mind anymore. They're very much on our mind and in our sight. Since that scandal, which brought it to our attention, we have spent around the clock trying to reform the system. We surrounded ourselves, I and other legislators, Jerry Madden in the House gets a lot of credit, surrounded ourselves with judges, prosecutors, activists. What's going on here? First of all, I said, let's see a profile. Who's going to our rural, remote state institutions? Some of everything. Misdemeanors, 12-year-olds, commingled with 18-year-olds. No classification by offenses. 9 hours from their family in the courts. So what we said was, first of all, let's prioritize who goes. Very much the same language that I use in the adult system. We got to distinguish who we're afraid of versus who we're mad at. The ones we're afraid of, yes, we're probably going to have to confine them. There are some dangerous youth, as we all know. But truants, repeat truants, car thieves being sent to state confined areas away from their communities, what happens in the remote areas? First of all, mental health drives a huge part of this problem. Certainly education. Drug and alcohol treatment, psychiatric care. None of that's realized in the remote rural parts of Texas. So we started saying, listen, first of all, the juvenile probation departments, keep as many of your youth as you can, and we will let the state money follow the youth back to the community. We had 5,000 confinees 6 years ago at state institutions. We've successfully shut down 6 of the 12. Got one in the budget currently to be closed. How many do you think we have confined today? 1,100. 1,100. And we're still working on that model. We still can keep more in their community. I have to be careful. I'm certainly not most of you today when I say keep them at home. I don't mean in their home literally. In their community. If they need to be confined, yes. Saving money, and it appeals to the fiscal conservatives in the legislature. To those who want to do the right thing, it appeals to them. Many, many more improvements can be made. We still, folks, not doing early intervention. The suspensions at our schools.
So I'm going to take that with the school issue. We're going to come back to, Senator.
We can do better, but what you have to do is first, don't let the facilities be out of sight, out of mind. You got to have forums like this, and you got to have political leaders that are willing to take a chance and confront the issue and say there is a better model. No one can accept we've always done it that way. They go out to West Texas and they come back. No. Keep them at home is the first priority.
So just heard from two very different states, right? Connecticut and Texas, yet this similar theme of dramatic downsizing of the number of kids in secure confinement, and another very important theme, which is really making sure that just because a lot of money was saved in the state system, that didn't get lost in the state coffers, but instead really talking about how to reinvest a lot of those dollars to make sure that they followed the kids and reinvested in the right kinds of services. We're going to move now to Ohio, which many of you know has a very interesting model of making sure that those dollars follow those kids and actually set incentives for local communities. And Judge Teodosia, will you tell us a little bit about Reclaim Ohio and how that's been instrumental in changing the composition of the juvenile correctional facilities?
It would be my pleasure, and it's certainly a privilege to be here. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my good friend and colleague, David Stuckey, who is the president of the National Association of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, is here and has been a wonderful advocate for change in our state, along with Tom Stickrath, who you've already mentioned. But I did want to talk a bit about Reclaim Ohio. I think one thing about Reclaim that's so important is that when you think of Ohio, there are 88 separate counties, 88 separate elected judges that answer to 88 separate communities. And so to really impact statewide numbers, it became important for the state to look at what it needed to provide to those individual judges in order to really make a change and reduce the number of youth that are being incarcerated in our state penal system. So what Reclaim Ohio did is it really incentivized the courts to keep children in the communities, to develop programs that would allow children to be successfully treated and dealt with in the community. Speaking from my point of view, and I'm a person in the trenches every day working with youth, and I wouldn't have it any other way, but there are a lot of risks that come with working with youth. It's hard to predict. You know, who is a child that should be sent to the Department of Youth Services? Who is a child who can safely be maintained in the community? So while Ohio had this great method of incentivizing local communities to use monies to develop local programming that was designed to prevent kids from penetrating the system, they took it a step further. And they engaged the University of Cincinnati to develop something called the Ohio Youth Assessment System. They gave all of us in Ohio a validated tool that we could use in assessing youth and deciding, is this child low, moderate, or high risk to reoffend? And to match them up with appropriate programming based upon their level of risk. What's more, they coupled that with information such as the fact that if we put a low-risk child in a high-risk setting, we're not teaching that child to stay out of trouble, which is the typical wisdom. You know, if you confine them for a while, they'll learn a lesson, they won't be back. Instead, we were actually making children worse by confining them. So by providing us this tool and giving judges a means of predicting who would be best suited for certain types of programming, Ohio took it a step further in providing tools that were practical and could be used in the courtroom and in the communities every day by judges, probation officers, and others in the juvenile justice system.
Judge, just a question for the group. Can you help distinguish, or I guess contrast what it's like making a decision about where a kid goes before a risk assessment tool is used, and then what the difference is once that was actually instituted?
Sure. You know, when you think about a child coming before you, oftentimes it's very difficult to figure out what has impacted their choices that cause them to be in a certain place. And it's even more difficult to decide, you know, what is their risk of reoffending. As a judge, I have an obligation to look out for the best interest of the child, and that is part of my work each and every day. But also as judges, we have an obligation to assure community safety. So if I think that a child has committed an offense, but I don't know the likelihood of him reoffending, I might react more to a particular situation as opposed to what is the likelihood that this child will act again. If I know that I'm not risking community safety by keeping a child in the community because he's low or moderate risk to reoffend, then perhaps I can work some other programs with that child by providing him support, by working with his strengths, by allowing him to be successful in the community and build bridges with community services that can continue to serve that child after he ages out of our system or after our supervision has ended. What else Ohio did, which I think really drove the dramatic decrease in the number of youth that are committed to our Department of Youth Services, is they instituted 2 more programs. One was called Targeted Reclaim that really focused on youth that were likely to be committed to the Department of Youth Services, youth that had committed felony offenses, as well as a behavioral health juvenile justice grant, which again allowed some of the larger counties that were committing larger number of youth to take a look at what we were doing to work with children. And what the state said is, we will provide this funding, but we want you to use evidence-based or promising practices, things that are proven to work with the type of children that you're dealing with. So it allowed us to pick and choose from a menu and have some flexibility in funding and using things such as cognitive behavioral therapy that really focuses on the thinking errors that youth might have, their impulsivity, giving them the opportunity to practice the things that they're learning, so when they go back into the community, they won't make the same poor choices. It allows us to look at youth where they are and to build on their strengths and to provide them assistance within their home, within their communities, in their schools, where they really have to function each and every day. And more importantly, it allows us to take a look at some of those other factors that impact children's lives, such as their families. A big difference between the adult system and the juvenile system. I'm not just dealing with the child, I'm dealing with his entire family. So by doing these home-based services and providing parents with the tools that they need to strengthen their family and to provide positive reinforcement for their youth based on the things that that child has been learning through these evidence-based practices that are now being utilized in Ohio, we have seen a great deal of success in being able to successfully keep kids in their own communities.
So I'm going to jump in there, and you'll see we've gone through 3 states, right? 3 very similar lines, right? And the trajectory that they're going down. Different strategies that have been employed, where Connecticut talked about raising the age. Senator Whitmire talked about actually prohibiting local judges from sentencing kids who commit certain low-level offenses to the state system. Judge Teodosio talking about instituting these actuarial tools, which I know in Texas and Connecticut are also being used to be more predictive of which kids would most benefit from certain programs and which kids would not. And so really interesting examples. And now we turn to the federal perspective. Administrator Listenby, these are 3 very exciting states, and yet we know that there's a lot of other states out there that haven't necessarily taken these same steps. So what's the role of OJJDP and Department of Justice in helping really bring to bear the experiences of these states to other states across the country?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm very excited to be here. I want to thank the Senator Murphy, for inviting me to come and explain the role of OJJDP and the federal government in this type of reform effort. Mike, I'd like to thank you for all the work that you've done with the Council of State Governments, both in developing the report that you did in Texas on education, the work you're doing with the Supportive School Discipline Initiative, which is focusing on the school-to-prison pipeline. This is one of the most exciting times that I've ever experienced in juvenile justice. There are tremendous opportunities for reform, not just in the states that have embarked upon these changes, including states like Illinois, California, New York, and many others, but across the nation. And it is certainly my desire as administrator to play a major role, and for OJJDP to play a major role in this process. Let me touch on a few basic kinds of concepts that cut across all the different reform initiatives that we've discussed here at the present time, and also I think may be critical in looking at reform efforts across the nation. As many of you know, the National Academies of Science was commissioned by OJJDP 2 years ago to produce a report that looked at all the reform efforts across the nation and to provide us with a guide to explain what's really happening out there, to look at some of the best models going on across the nation. That report was formally released in June of this year, and just last Friday we had the National Academy's researchers come over to OJJDP and provide us with a sort of a primer on how things look from that perspective. One critical thing that they recommended was that we take a developmental approach to bringing about reform across the nation. And having looked at this myself, having experienced it on a practical day-to-day level with young people in Pennsylvania, I think they're heading in the right direction. We have not formally adopted this approach. We're examining it. Our staff is reading the 442-page report to make sure we fully understand it and that we can figure out how to go about doing this. We have some of the policy papers that we brought over here that are available to anybody who wants to take a quick look at it. They're pre-policy papers that explain the basic principles underlying this particular approach. But the Academy was very clear. They said that if we adopt this approach, we will probably do a better job of reducing reoffending. We will have better outcomes for youth. And also that if we fail to adopt this particular approach, we're really going to condemn a generation of youth to basically reoffending and having an antisocial attitude towards government officials and people who are involved in the juvenile justice system. So we're taking that very seriously. A second very critical piece of the pie is that Attorney General Eric Holder was given information about children's exposure to violence 3 years ago. He looked at that report on the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, found that 60% of our children across the nation in the year prior to the study have been exposed to one form of violence or another. 40% had been exposed to 2 or more forms of violence as witnesses and also as victims. And what we know from that report, and what we know, I know that directly because I was co-chair of the task force that undertook the report, is that violence and trauma that violence causes intersects the developmental process and derails it. It prevents many children from being able to reach their full potential in the educational process and being able to reach their full potential as citizens going across the nation. A quick comment, Joe Torrey, who was co-chair of the task force with me, told us about a story about him at age 55 having to go get counseling because the trauma that he had experienced through domestic violence in his home had caused him to have problems, and his wife encouraged him to get counseling to address that issue. Here is a grown man, one of the most successful baseball players we've had, and manager of the Yankees, who beat a lot of teams that I like, finding out and talking about how trauma was affecting him as an adult. That's really critical. We also want to talk about, and was mentioned earlier, evidence-based risk assessment tools to decide what children need, what their mental health issues are, and to find out what those needs are so that we can address them. We think this is critical in looking at what's going on across the nation. Now, one of the most important things, and I'm available with just 2 more comments to stop and let Mike continue. One of them is, as we've looked at the move to remove kids from detention centers and from placement facilities, one of the things that we've seen developing across the nation is evidence-based community treatment programs, evidence-based diversion programs, evidence-based activities with families and family-centered activities in the community. We don't really know a lot about those from the federal level. I can't draw you or provide you with a continuum of services, of evidence-based community activities that we can encourage the states to follow. I looked at the Connecticut Model, and one of the things I saw is that for a specified period of time, they had increased their funding from $300,000 for community-based activities and community-based programs to $39 million for community-based activities and programs. Similarly, in Texas and Ohio, there's a move afoot to address these programs. One of the things that the federal government can do, and we hope to be able to do, is to help develop a continuum, a toolkit of different kinds of evidence-based community programs that we can make available to the states to continue this reform process. Finally, one of the most important aspects of reform is to be able to document where you are when you start and have the data to show whether you're making progress or not. And one of the things that OJJDP has done really well in the past was to be able to provide information on confinement. A day in the life of confinement throughout the United States is one of the databases that we use and have developed. We're open to looking at that and perhaps even reforming it and making it better, but it is a tool used by almost all the reformers to look at where they are in terms of confinement in the nation. We think that that's absolutely critical in looking at where we go with reform. So what can we do? We're looking to work with the states. We want to find those that are actually piloting reform efforts at all levels and figure out whether or not we can come together either through various kinds of convenings, through webinars, through trainings, through training technical assistance, to shine a bright light on what's really working, and equally important, to talk about what's not working. We don't want to invest money in things that are not working. We're very fortunate to have had Commissioner Gladys Carrion from the state of New York with us last Friday, and she said a couple of very basic and important things. In the state of New York, it was costing $262,000 per year for secure confinement per child, and she had closed down 21 facilities during the time that she's been there, I believe about 5 years. So they've reduced the number of kids in state confinement, and they developed a wide range of community-based options. I think those are some of the things we can do, and as we go on with further questions, I'll address others. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Administrator. So what makes this panel so special is not only what they've achieved in really overhauling their juvenile justice system, but as I mentioned at the outset, understanding the connection to what happens in schools. And so I want to now really go much earlier in the continuum and just talk very quickly, if we could, about what you're doing to really shine a spotlight as well on that connection between schools and the juvenile justice system. Undersecretary Lawler, I know Connecticut's done a couple of things. I mean, I know just recently there was a statistic that came out about suspension rates even among kindergartners, and Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then also what the state's doing to really limit the extent to which schools can refer kids to the juvenile justice system.
Should I still stand up? Well,
Please,
I guess
yeah.
we have to. But so very briefly, Mike just mentioned it, and we've been emphasizing the importance of data-driven solutions. And you need data and evidence to back up what you should do in the future, but you also need it to understand what's wrong today. And one of the interesting statistics that shocked all of us that emerged just a few weeks ago, really, is that they went back last year to determine how many kindergartners in Connecticut were suspended from school, right? And Connecticut's a small state. 2,000 kindergartners were suspended from school, and as the study that CSG did in Texas indicated, you get very different results in similar schools in different locations. So just for example, in New Haven versus Bridgeport, two cities that are very similar in many ways, same size certainly, there was 79 suspensions of kindergartners in New Haven, which you'd think is high. There was almost 300 in Bridgeport. And you have to wonder, like, what the hell's going on in this school that kindergartners are getting, and we're talking about suspended to go home. And so part of the reforms that's taken place is there are a lot of options that are not so much mandatory, but there's a lot of pressure to force educators and juvenile probation officers and others to look at alternatives before pulling the trigger on a suspension. Because what we do know, based on the Texas data, and I think it's valid in Connecticut too, that the best indicator of a kid who's going to end up in the criminal justice system is repeated suspensions earlier on. And there's a strong correlation there, and our goal is to avoid that. But knowing how many kindergartners were suspended changed the entire discussion in Connecticut.
And one thing that Connecticut did that's also really interesting is actually said that for certain low-level offenses, the schools could not refer those kids to the juvenile justice system, and instead had to figure out how to deal with those issues at the school level. And we've got a number of terrific educators in the room, from principals to superintendents to teachers, who are all can talk about some wonderfully creative strategies that they've used to really explore new approaches to providing a better and more nurturing school climate in the school. Senator Whitmire, I know that you commissioned a study in Texas that had some stunning numbers about just how many kids were getting suspended and expelled, and you've really made this a top priority for Texas.
Yes, and I left out a while ago why we were able to drop those numbers so significantly. A lot of county probation, county government involvement, but also you cannot go to a state confined location without committing a felony. Huge difference. The reserve, that is the last option for some of your more incorrigible, and the others would be kept in their community working with their professional. As we continue to work in criminal justice, I would hear reports about, I'm getting a ticket, I've got to go to court because my child won't go to school. A lady took care of my mother in a nursing home, working 2 jobs, 2 shifts, called me and said, I don't know what to do. I've got to go to a justice peace court. I leave at 6:30 in the morning for my 7 o'clock job. Now Kevin's got a $500 ticket. I got a $500 ticket. I don't know what to do. So I called the JP and I said, I know this lady's circumstances. She has no money. She's doing the best she can. Why are we criminalizing her son not going to school? He said, I'll take that in consideration. He dismissed the tickets, but $80 court costs on each ticket. That was my first awareness of how we're beginning to criminalize school behavior, truancy being at the very top. It almost has become an industry, Judge. In Texas, we have truancy courts. And you try to cut out the ticketing for truancy because all this will lead to suspensions, which will then lead into the juvenile justice system. And the courts would push back. Some of the legislators would push back. They needed that revenue source to run their truancy courts. And I understand truancy is a serious matter, but that does not solve. In Houston the other day, we have some case manager pilot programs that we're working in municipal courts, and they showed me a case, and you have to put a face on it. That's something I would urge all of you to do when you work in this field. Find you a case that explains it better than the data does itself. Young 14-year-old lady from inner city Houston not going to school. They send her a citation. Court manager goes and checks out, what is your circumstances? Should do on each case, but they did on this case. She's 14, pregnant, doesn't have maternity clothes, and we're trying to place her in the criminal justice system. Ticketing for disorderly conduct is rampant across the state of Texas. I've passed legislation, first of all, there was no age limit. We were doing 6-year-olds for disorderly conduct. I'd have assistant superintendent before my committee. I'd say, explain to me how you write a 10-year-old a disorderly conduct ticket. How does she conceptualize what's happening? Senator, we believe in accountability. I said, yeah, and so do I, and I'm gonna hold you accountable. So I was only able to stop it at 12 years of age. In this session, we passed more, making it where you don't have school police officers walking the halls with his ticket book, like writing traffic tickets. Now you've got to at least have a complainant. The teacher's got to get involved. All this fits into the juvenile justice system. When you write these tickets and they go to court, they get profiled. They get a case number. They get labeled. If you go to an alternative school, you're singled out. You get behind in your studies. If you're suspended, you hit the streets, and then you'll feed right into the state juvenile justice system. So one, it's awareness, it's talking about it, reaching out into my more conservative law and order, which I'm as tough as they come, but you can't just be tough. You have to be smart. It applies to the adult system, it applies to the juvenile. Yes, we want accountability. So yes, there's going to be kids that you have to confine, but you got to be smart about it. You got to look at what the reentry process. You can't take an African-American young man from the inner city of Houston, take him to the far reaches of West Texas. He will never have a mentor that understands his culture, his life that he has to return to, and goes back to Houston. You wonder why he reoffends. You got to be smart, and you can actually save money. Pay now or pay later. It makes a lot of sense. You can get involved in the school system, kindergarten, or you're going to pay these exorbitant amounts. We're in the process of closing down a juvenile facility in Corsicana, east of Dallas, about an hour. We're spending $112,000 per year on these children. One of the administrators said, you know, you could probably send that kid out to Betty Ford Clinic for what we're spending here. You got to appeal to the fiscal conservatives. There's a better model. You got to appeal to those who just want to do the moral right thing. And before you know it, you got to get the legislators to take risks.
So,
and you know what? You'll have a bad incident. It happens to me throughout the criminal justice field. You'll be making progress. We're going to deal with immigrants this way. We got 2,000 Mexican nationals confined in Texas prisons. I'll get a program going where we're going to parole them back to their families in Mexico, and I'll have an incident in San Antonio, hurt a police officer, and it sets me back.
Hayne, I swear we weren't doing a panel on
you can't
immigration.
quit.
Um, so,
But you can't quit taking chances, because it will make a difference, and you got to keep saying it until they believe it.
Thank you, Senator. And again, one thing that's really changed, actually, I think a lot, the practices in Texas, is the Senator just shining a light on it. Just a couple of statistics for you. 83% of all African-American males in the state of Texas experience suspension or expulsion at least once between 7th and 12th grade. 83%. 70% of African-American females experience suspension or expulsion at least once between 7th and 12th grade. So you are highly unusual now if you are not being suspended or expelled at least once in the state of Texas. Now, and we also know this is not unique to Texas. You heard some statistics from Connecticut, and as Judge Teodosio will tell you, this is also a big problem in Ohio. And Judge Teodosio, can you talk a little bit about what the court system is doing to divert some of these kids from the justice system? And then we'll go quickly to the administrator, and then we want to have a discussion with you and open it up for questions and answers. So, Judge?
Before I address specifically what we've done, I did want to mention that I do have some materials that go in a little bit more detail. In the limited time we had today, I couldn't get into a great deal of detail, so I hope that you will take some of our materials. Some of them explain the program that I'm about to describe, and Ohio and my court in particular were really privileged to be able to work with the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change Mental Health Juvenile Justice Actions Network, as well as the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, and working on some front-end diversion programs. And what we really focused on is the fact that many youth that find their way deeper and deeper into the juvenile justice system do suffer from mental health disorders. I think some of the national statistics show that somewhere in the area of 70% of incarcerated youth have some kind of diagnosable mental health disorder. So what we decided to do is to try to take a look at putting a program into place that would be able to intercept these kids at the earliest possible point and divert them to treatment, as opposed to placing them in the juvenile justice system, with the recognition that if they could receive treatment from their undiagnosed or untreated mental health disorder, we could solve the behavioral issues that they were experiencing at school and perhaps keep them from entering into our system. So what we looked at doing is putting in a program that we call our school responder program. And in my court, our school responder is a licensed social worker who the school can call in the instance of a child being truant, in the instance of a child exhibiting this bad behavior that may be attributable to an untreated, undiagnosed mental health disorder. The responder can go to the school, meet with the child, meet with the parent, meet with the teacher, meet with others that are significant folks in that child's life after doing a screen using the Macy, after doing a social interview, and make the decision as to whether or not the child should be referred for a more detailed mental health assessment, and then make referrals for treatment services as opposed to channeling them into the juvenile justice system. The schools have been a great partner in this. They recognize that it gives them another tool, another option, rather than siphoning kids off to court. And we've seen a great deal of success with kids that have been directed to treatment as well, especially when the child and family really have a part in deciding where that treatment will take place, how it will occur, and really can be active in seeking remedies for themselves. So I think it's really important to look at issues such as mental health that really drive kids deeper into the system and use innovative programs such as the Responder to really move them away from juvenile justice and place them in the mental health arena where they belong and where they can really get the help that they need.
Terrific. Thank you, Judge. And I just want to thank some of the data we've been, this slide in particular, courtesy of National Juvenile Justice Network and Texas Public Policy Foundation, just so many great advocacy groups working together. I know Senator Murphy singled out a bunch of them, so thank you very much. Administrator Listenby, I know that one of the things that we've all been excited about in the field is this partnership from the cabinet level that really demonstrates the justice school partnership that we think is necessary to really affect change in this area. Can you talk a little bit about the Supported School Discipline Initiative?
Yes, Attorney General Eric Holder and Secretary Duncan heard about the report that had been done in Texas with the assistance of the Council of State Governments and also the assistance of the Texas Legislature. One of the facts that was most striking to them was that 60% of the children between the 7th and 12th grade had either been suspended or expelled. When they heard that fact, I mean, they were absolutely astounded. And you know, this was an extraordinary piece of work. When I heard about the work you had done, I was just amazed that you were able to actually have 1 million student records examined so that you could come up with the data, which is phenomenal. We have people here who are the real heroes of the work that we're doing here in this country. And to have so many students examined, to come up with those kinds of statistics, when the Attorney General and the Secretary heard that, they set about developing the Supported School Discipline Initiative. It involves a number of different components. We have, on one part, the Department of Education is developing a guidance package for schools. They're working on that to be released at a given point in time, the time to be decided, hopefully early next year. We also have the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I just spoke with Judge Stuckey earlier today, that is working with Judge Teskey to develop a package of I believe, alternative types of memoranda that can be used by school districts in conjunction with juvenile justice systems and law enforcement to try and reduce the need to move kids out of the schools and into the juvenile justice system. And along with that, the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department is working on civil rights guidance to make clear what is mandatory under the civil rights rules and what is not, and give some guidance to the schools along those lines. And we're, of course, looking at how other kinds of community-based options, so where you do have children who are removed from school, rather than moving them into the juvenile justice system, some options are available there. So that's what's going on now with the Supported School Discipline Initiative. It is one that is still a signature initiative of the administration, and we're doing everything we can to bring it to successful completion. We're working closely with the Council of State Governments. And perhaps one of the most important parts of this initiative is that we needed a consensus document, a document that could be supported by people from different political points of view. And Mike is taking the lead on developing that document, and we're looking forward to that completion of that document so that can be put together with the other pieces and we can share them early next year. Before I came to government, one of the things I heard so much about was the school-to-prison pipeline. There's such a yearning across this nation to do something about this problem. Han was very instrumental last year in having a Senate hearing on the 12th of December of 2012. And one of the striking things about that hearing was that there were so many people who showed up, I think 400 or 500, that they had to have an overflow room there. I spoke about the Supported School Discipline Initiative last Thursday at the National Urban League annual conference. And one thing people said out there that really resonated with me is that this country is yearning for hope, some hope that we can address these problems. And when I talked about this particular initiative, people came up to me afterward and said, we had no idea that our government and our people were actually trying to solve this problem. So for so many of you that I've talked to about this issue, continue to work hard to share what knowledge you have and help us, once we have finished our part of the work, and continue to do your part of the work to try and address this problem. I read about Connecticut's example. I was very encouraged about the work that's going on in Bridgeport and New Haven. I've read about what's going on in Ohio. I'm too encouraged. The federal government can't do all of this. The federal government, in conjunction with the Council of State Governments, can't do all of this. We really need all of you who are out there across this nation to continue to develop various kinds of approaches to address this problem in your own communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator. So we're going to open it up to have a discussion with you. And so this is where we invite you to ask questions of our panel. So anyone? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My question is in regards to the Affordable Care Act. OJJDP and DJA put out a report that dealt with the termination or suspension of federal assistance for juveniles. So when they're detained, they may lose their federal assistance. And when they're released, they may not have mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, abilities that they were getting through the state while they were detained. And now that they have lost their federal resources or federal benefits have been terminated, it takes about 3 months to get them back on the books. So now that we have this situation with the Affordable Care Act and possible punitive damages, could we, as it relates to the parent and those who are uninsured, could we be setting that population up for failure with regards to seeking assistance and getting assistance? Is it possible to just eliminate the term, how should I say, for the legislature, to eliminate the term termination and just use suspension for juvenile detention? Those juveniles who are detained,
So
they're immediately back on the roll.
thank you for the question. So not only do we have 3 branches of government, 3 politically different states, we have 3 states that are in very different places regarding ACA, right? We've got a state that's adopting ACA in Connecticut. We've got a state in Texas that's made it pretty clear it's not going in that direction. And then we've got Ohio that when I last checked was on the fence and not sure where they are now. So what an interesting cross-section. And Administrator Listenby, we won't ask you to get into HHS policies in addition to DOJ, but I will ask our panel just on this difficult subject of financing these healthcare services and tying them to these different federal funding streams. I mean, ACA is one issue, but as I just mentioned, it really depends on the state that you're talking about how that's playing out. Any strategies that you all have been looking at as to how to fund some of the healthcare services that Judge Teodosio spoke so eloquently about them needing? Mike, any thoughts on coming from a budget agency in Connecticut?
Well, you're a little bit outside my area of expertise, but I believe, and Mike, you may know, I think even before ACA, if you were detained or incarcerated, you're ineligible for Medicaid. So that really hasn't changed that much. And I can say there's a lot of states, including Connecticut, that are exploring strategies about how both adult and juveniles, keeping them connected to health care, because especially when it relates to mental health, it's very important to maintain that connection. And if there was ever, if you ever need the reason for that to be reinforced, look at the tragedy that happened in Newtown, the importance of keeping people who need to be connected to health care, especially mental health care, connected. It's also the case that if you can keep them out of detention, I don't think you lose that coverage, right, Mike? And so one of the many advantages of avoiding the incarceration of as many children as possible is to not interrupt that kind of coverage. But that preceded ACA as a problem, and I know we're trying to explore some innovative solutions.
Right, and we're definitely finding from states across the country that I think too many. This issue gets so complicated so fast, right? And in many ways, for as many opportunities as ACA has created, from people who are sort of in the non-governmental organizations, it almost confuses things as you're trying to explain things to people from different states. I will say from our perspective, it would be immensely helpful from a federal agency perspective to really highlight different strategies that states are taking in compliance with federal regulations to make sure, because I think no matter what your perspective, you can all agree that when you have a kid who's eligible for that federal funding, we need to make sure that that financing stream, that there's no lapse in it, and that we keep that kid connected for reasons, as Undersecretary Lawler was talking about, to those benefits. And so everybody can agree on that goal, but it gets crazy complicated when we start hearing about all the regulations, and it becomes somewhat paralyzing. Having a really clear statement, from different federal agencies about different strategies different states are employing would be really helpful. Other questions from the audience? Yes, sir. John Kelly.
I want to thank you all for recognizing the intersection with mental health needs, particularly with children. And one of the frustrations that we have is that we don't have enough people in the community that work with children, particularly young children. So I'm wondering if you could talk at all from your experiences of working with the school-employed mental health professionals and maybe how they have fit within your systems.
I'll turn to both Judge Teodosio and Senator Whitmire. How have you seen, you talked about a mental health point person in your courtroom. How do they correspond to, this is a question, John Kelly's a leader in the National Association of School Psychologists. How do they loop back to those mental health professionals based in the school?
Well, in Summit County in particular, which is what I can speak to, we work very closely with the mental health providers within the schools. There are local agencies that actually provide counseling and therapy for children in the schools, which certainly makes it much easier for children to attend. The parents don't have one more place to take them. They are right there in the school and can receive the services there. Our school responder that I spoke of earlier acts as a case manager, bringing folks together to try to work with those agencies within the school to direct them to receiving those services there. So it really is a partnership between the school personnel and the court and community mental health to work together to make sure that the children receive those services that they need in the most appropriate setting and with the least amount of difficulty possible.
And Senator Whitmire, I know you've been a real champion on trying to integrate these different kinds of services.
It's just probably the most neglected area of state government in nearly each state is the mental health services, largely because there's not a constituency. They don't have a highway contract lobby. They don't have a private prison lobby. A lot of the things that make things happen at the state and federal level. It's incumbent upon us to make that issue and to show the connection that you either pay now, you spend money on mental health services, or you'll be spending money in the juvenile justice system. The schools in Texas do a very poor job of detecting mental health issues, and quite frankly, those juvenile facilities do a very poor job. I'm in a huge battle right now. The psychiatric facility for the juvenile justice system is in that Corsicana. We told the agency to move it. It's in the budget, and before I came down here this week, I'm knocking heads with the senator and the state rep from that area. That's what you're up against, the jobs that the local, smaller communities want. The common theme that all of us on the panel are describing today is what we're doing is cost effective. It's just, it's a common theme there. So you've got to get the policymakers to understand there is a better model, it has better results, and it's going to save you money. And you have to guard against what they're all concerned about at the local level is unfunded mandates. I've heard about it since I got elected 100 years ago. You got to guard against that. And that is the beauty in our programs also, is the money will follow the child. Don't send a youth to the state youth services. Keep them in the county, near their community, near their school, near their mental health services. And in fact, you'll get better services and save money. So let me just suggest, I was sitting there saying, well, what am I going to say about mental health? I'm here to tell you, we've made great improvements, but we have a long ways to go. And I'm certain my colleagues up here would say that too. We've made strides, but there's so much left to be done. Mental health should be one of our highest priorities.
Administrator Listenby, would you like to speak to mental health?
Yes, ever so briefly. One of the things that I found when I arrived at OJJDP was that SAMHSA had conducted a study on mental health and substance abuse disorders. And it's a very thorough study on what happens to our children And what we're trying to do at our level is to integrate our policies in juvenile justice with those related to mental health issues, substance abuse. Obviously, the report I referred to earlier about children's exposure to violence. And so I think that anybody who wants to get a good comprehensive understanding of what the federal government is trying to do should take a look at that report and look at the other reports that I just referenced, and the Children's Exposure to Violence Executive Summary, I think we brought copies of as well. So again, we're trying to integrate the policies and make sure that we integrate them not just at the federal level, but as we work with partners throughout the states, so that we're all talking about the same child and the same complete child rather than pieces of the child. And we're trying to make sure that the resources, even with the Affordable Care Act, are identified and combined in the way we talk about them at the federal level.
So this question again about how a school-based mental health professional is talking to a mental health professional potentially in the juvenile justice system gets to another interesting set of questions, which I know we've talked about under Secretary Lawler, which is we want to share information, and yet we run into concerns about confidentiality and what is permissible and what's not. And I know that on the one hand, we really want to be protective, and on the other hand, we don't want to be paralyzed. I know you've talked about ways in which the federal government might be able to be helpful here.
Yeah, this is actually, in my experience at least, this became a really big problem as we're trying to, it's one thing to conceptually talk about these things, it's another thing to actually get it enacted and get all the stakeholders on board. And one theme that was very common, whether it was in the 1990s in the first go-round or over the last 5 or 10 years as we did our Raise the Age initiative, that a lot of the stakeholders will tell you that we'd like to do that, but we can't share that kind of information. We can't collaborate in that way because of usually citing federal confidentiality laws. It could be school teachers, it could be mental health providers, it could be criminal justice folks. And what we found when we got them to sit down and focus on what the real obstacles were, at least what they perceived them to be, it turned out that a lot of that was based on either a myth or a misunderstanding of the actual federal laws. And we found it very helpful to bring in people from SAMHSA or elsewhere, DOE, to actually explain what the federal confidentiality laws actually were. And so I think if we're looking what would be a useful federal role in helping to foster the kind of reforms we're talking about, and that is the technical assistance that helps state and local folks work their way through these apparent obstacles. Because it turned, at least in my experience, it turned out that the vast majority of the time, we're talking about a myth, not a reality. And they're not going to believe me if I say that. They're probably not going to believe you if you say that. But if you get the actual authorities here to say, no, that particular communication you're talking about is allowed under our law, and there's usually a couple of safeguards that go with that, but it's very clear that you can break through these obstacles.
So Mr. Osumi wanted to respond to that, and then we'll take our next question.
Yes, that is certainly something that we may be able to help with. We certainly will make notes and follow up on that. And we encourage any of you who have specific kinds of issues to contact us, and maybe we can use the specific problems you have as ways of working our way through a really practical set of problems. One other thing I want to point out, I've advocated as co-chair of the Attorney General's Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence that all children should be assessed so that we can determine whether they've been exposed to violence and get them appropriate treatment. A very close friend who is a very strong advocate in the defense community stood up at the same conference where I was advocating for this and said, I will never let my clients be assessed before an adjudicatory hearing. So in the defense community, there is a concern, I believe a legitimate concern and issue. I invite those of you who are members of the defense community and members of the juvenile justice community to help us work through that. There are some legal ways to do that in each state, because they're not federal laws that are going to do that. There's going to be state laws where you can protect the confidentiality of the assessment from the adjudicatory hearing process so that we can address the issues concerning children early on and then be able to address their needs and issues without it filtering through to the adjudicatory hearing process. So I challenge you to help us with that process. Thank you.
Appreciate you raising that. Dr. David Osher from American Institute of Research.
I'm going to make a comment if I can, and if you want to comment. Thank you for your good work. What you're talking about is not just important in terms of helping these kids. It's important in terms of making education better for all kids. And I'm saying that because Senator Murphy's on the Education Committee, and I think that's a key issue. We should not see this getting segmented. And about in terms of addressing young people who have experienced trauma, that's 60%, let us say, it's really important for us to be thinking about what happens universally in schools. Many of us today were at a council meeting on those issues. And how do we create school environments that work for all young people and make them feel safer and connected and things like that? And so I'd ask the panel to talk about, from your experience, how important is that universal focus in schools for all kids, creating conditions that can address the concerns you have for some kids who are getting in trouble.
So again, I think the issue of what can we do working with our partners in the school, not to just focus on the kids who are coming into contact with the juvenile justice system, but to create a climate in those schools that really engages all kids and makes them feel nurtured and engaged in a learning experience. It's interesting to get people who come from a justice perspective talking about these core education issues, right? And that's why it's great that Dr. Osher raised it. Anyone from our panel in particular want to comment on that issue?
I was just thinking a while ago, we were focused on mental health, but it's first you have to diagnose it, but it's not only that. I was thinking about, you go, there's a common theme among the students locked up, is their education level. I mean, most of them can't read and write. So they've dropped out. No one helped them early. And you can't imagine something that you could diagnose like dyslexia. I mean, you know, the system's just full of kids that just had learning challenges and just got frustrated because they were a couple of grades behind. They hit the streets, their peer group or gangs. Welcome to the criminal justice system. So there again, you can spend money on the front end, pay now, or you're going to pay later. And you pay later, you may be with your life for some harm. So the good news is we're talking about it. You know, I've pointed out, I've been in state government a long time. We haven't really discussed this until the last few years. Some of the tragedies around the country have led to talking about school safety, which led to talking about ticketing and all the other juvenile justice issues. But, you know, I'm encouraged that we're here today, we're talking, but I would certainly try to recruit as many activists and ambassadors as possible. There's a lot of work has to be done. And certainly it starts with education. You know, in Texas, we've cut back, as many states have, on just funding on basic education services. And I promise you, some of the first ones were the school counselors cut out. We were supposed to help detect that. The school nurses, a lot of the providers that were assigned, you know, the juvenile probation officers, caseloads have been increased. So, you know, you pay now or you pay later. You have to let people know what we're doing makes economic sense, and it makes a lot better community, a safer community, and a more productive community than the alternatives.
But it's a fascinating point, again, that brings us together here, right? This question of, do we focus on the children who are coming into contact with police, being pushed into the juvenile justice system? What do we do? And David's bringing us back to this question of what about engaging all kids in school? And Dr. Kelly gave us a wonderful example earlier, and he said, imagine where you just have every student's name on a chart and a gold star. Mm-hmm. He said, and imagine if you had all employees of the school put a gold star next to the students that they had a relationship with or some kind of contact. Imagine if we could then see which students have next to no gold stars next to their name. How do we go and engage those kids in the school in a learning environment, right? Getting in the justice system, be talking and thinking that way with our partners in education really kind of creates a common denominator, a common language that we haven't been able to achieve so far. Last word, Judge Teodosio. And Hayne, how are we on time? Do you have one more question? Okay, so Judge Teodosio, and then we have one more question.
I just really wanted quickly to respond to the issue of kids in school, because I think what's really important to recognize is that as we're dealing with these youth that come through our system, we tend to talk about youth in general, and I think that what we really need to recognize is each of these children are individuals. They all have their own needs and strengths, and what we really strive to do, I think, in the court system is to address those specific needs and the specific risks that a child has and to build them up. What I see as a particular risk for kids in school are a number of things. I think that kids falling behind academically poses a great threat for kids, because I think a lot of times kids would rather be perceived as the troublemaker than the kid that can't read. So doing things to encourage academic achievement, determining why that isn't occurring, and really focusing on what we can do to make the learning experience better for children. But I think in this day of social media and some of the things that are happening, we see a lot of bullying, a lot of cyberbullying that makes it very uncomfortable for kids to attend school, and I think we really need to have to get a handle on that. What I'm seeing in my court is not so much the bullies, but the bully that finally has had enough and reacts back, and they end up finding themselves involved in the juvenile justice system. So I think it goes beyond just the educational aspects, but we really have to take a look at what's happening in social media and texting and some of those things that are really making it difficult for our children to feel safe and secure within the school.
Last question.
Thank you so much for your leadership and your vision and your work. So I heard a distinction today throughout the panel and throughout the work we all in this room do between young people that many people feel can be safely served in their communities. You spoke about various programs, and young people that some may feel, as the judge and others spoke about, need to be confined. And I want to sort of think a little bit about how we might help those young people who are confined, and just briefly articulate some of the concerns. Is obviously there's tremendous trauma-based research about confinement increasing trauma to young people, the sexual, physical, and emotional abuse many young people suffer. Also children in solitary confinement throughout our nation, children in adult prisons, but also for children in youth systems. And the work the Department of Justice, for example, has done exposing the abuse that has happened in my own state of New York, but throughout the nation in many facilities, whether local, state-run, small, big, assorted types of facilities. And also the large field of research by criminologists that show that confinement actually hurts public safety, that when young people who have been confined are released, they tend to recidivate at higher rates than young people who haven't been, so that the public safety might be served in the short term, but there's a long-term consequence to public safety. So I'm interested in what strategies you all support or recommend for helping young people who, if there is a determination they have to be confined, how do we address things like solitary confinement, kids in adult facilities, the lack of services inside of facilities, the abuse of kids inside facilities, so that if some young people do wind up locked up, we're both helping them and promoting public safety in the long term.
It's an interesting challenge we hear. I know Tom Stickrath, I mentioned him earlier, ran the juvenile justice system in Ohio, said one of the biggest challenges he faces now is as they've dramatically downsized their population, the juvenile correctional facility, the type of youth that's now in those facilities really represents a certain core of kids that haven't responded to other kinds of strategies. Point's been made. We know that confinement has the potential to induce further trauma, further connection to the criminal justice system. What do we do with those kids who are kind of left behind, if you will, in those correctional facilities? Mike Lawler in Connecticut, I know this is something, you still have a core group of kids that are there, and this is a difficult population in many ways to find the right approaches for. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, well, I mean, the goal is to avoid it at all costs, obviously. I mean, it's the last resort, and it wasn't always the case. And one thing that was going on in Connecticut just a few years ago is that the average stay in confinement was relatively short, 3, 4, 5 months, and there's really nothing, as far as I know, that you can actually accomplish in that short a period of time. These are very intensive interventions, but over a very short period of time. And so it wasn't clear that even though, on average, we were spending about $400,000 a year per kid in our juvenile prison in Connecticut, but they were only staying like 6 months, and so nothing good was coming of it. So if you're going to have to incarcerate a kid for an extended period of time, at least do something programmatically while they're there, have an intervention that works. And in CJTS, our juvenile prison equivalent, a lot of time and energy has been devoted into upgrading their abilities. They're finally accredited, for example, and the facility itself is just a disaster. It's one of the exhibit number one in the impeachment of our former governor was the corrupt deal that led to that being constructed, and he ended up in prison himself, it's worth noting. But like, for example, there wasn't even windows in some of the cells. And so that kind of thing, obviously, is not going to be repeated in our state. But you're quite right. And I don't think we have it perfect now, but we've got it down to a small number. They're staying for long enough to have an intervention, and there's a lot more to be done. And those of you who are in Connecticut know who Martha Stone is, and she's a constant advocate for these children. And I'm quite confident the legislature and the governor will be focused on that as we go by, but hopefully we can get the numbers down a little bit more.
We're past the 5:30 mark. I want to thank Senator Murphy for bringing together just a terrific group of leaders from across the country and our representative of the key federal agency on this. And again, this bringing together of the school discipline community and the juvenile justice community, and to all of you for really bringing this issue and lifting it up in the way you have. Thank you again to Senator Murphy, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Senator Whitman, I need to shake your hand. I've just so appreciated the work